At the beginning of the end, the council gathered to make a decision, but not all of them truly agreed. That meeting would mark the start of something no one in the galaxy had foreseen. The Great Hall of the Galactic Council loomed vast and cold, its towering pillars stretching into the void beyond the reinforced plasma-infused crystal dome above. Starlight poured in, casting long, pale shadows over the councillors seated in the semicircular chamber. The air carried the weight of a war already lost. Holographic projections hovered in the center of the room, displaying tactical reports, casualty counts, and the encroaching tide of destruction spreading across the galactic map. High Counselor Valorn stood at the central podium, his elongated, deep-set eyes scanning the gathered representatives. His skin, a translucent shade of violet, shimmered under the artificial lighting. The weight of responsibility bore heavily upon him, his forearms resting heavily on the carved stone podium. His voice, though measured, carried the finality of a funeral toll. The war is lost. Silence followed. The words were a confirmation of what every leader in the room already knew, but to hear them spoken aloud, with no pretense, no delusions of hope, it hollowed the air. Valorn gestured, and the projection shifted, displaying the grim realities. Aerial footage of burning colonies, the wreckage of shattered fleets, left adrift in the void. System after system, reduced to ruin under the relentless advance of the Cathar. For 2 decades, this had been the only reality the galaxy had known. 20 years of war, 20 years of systems vanishing under Cathar bombardments, of desperate evacuations and last stands that had all ended the same way. The early battles had been hopeful, the alliances strong, but hope had faded. And now, even the strongest among them could see no way forward. Our fleets are depleted, he continued. Our military infrastructure is crumbling. The Cathar have adapted to every countermeasure we deployed. They do not negotiate, they do not relent. We have but one course of action left. He let the words settle before delivering the final blow. The Council decrees the immediate withdrawal of all remaining forces. We will consolidate what remains of our civilization elsewhere. We must preserve what little is left. A murmur swept through the chamber. Resigned acceptance, reluctant nods. They had fought, they had bled, and now they would retreat. All but one. The chair of the United Earth Defense Representative remained occupied. A human rose from his seat. That seat had once belonged to Chancellor Van Dien, a seasoned diplomat, a voice of reason among the chaos. His absence was a wound still fresh. He had perished mere weeks ago when the Cathar ambushed a peace summit on the Orion Verge. No negotiations, no demands, just extermination. Now, Admiral Jason Ryder sat in his place, not a diplomat, not a politician, a soldier. Once, the humans had been nothing more than an afterthought in this war, a young species, untested on the galactic stage, sent to the worst battlefields, given the missions no one else would take, the expendables. And yet, while other fleets shattered, while older empires crumbled, humanity endured, again and again. The war had forged them, and now, when all others saw only the inevitability of defeat, they saw something else. His uniform was immaculate, his posture imposing. His gaze, sharp as a blade, swept across the room with an intensity that made the counselors shift in their seats. His dark hair was cut short, a streak of silver running through the temples, a mark of the years he had spent on the front lines. His voice rang out, devoid of anger but filled with something the council had long abandoned, conviction. "You may retreat," he said, voice calm but firm. "But humanity will not." The silence that followed was different, not of acceptance, but of disbelief. Some counselors stiffened, others glanced at their peers as if seeking silent confirmation of their own thoughts. The reptilian Draenok warlord rumbled low, his amber eyes narrowing with what could only be suspicion. Across the room, the silver-skinned Velari leaned forward, his luminous gaze calculating, intrigued rather than dismissive. Valorn's face turned to his direction. "Admiral Ryder, you've seen what the Cathar do," Ryder continued, his words cutting through Valorn's interruption. "They do not conquer, they eradicate. You can flee today, but they will find you again. And when they do, you will have to fight them anyway. The only question is whether you fight now, with a chance to turn the tide, or later, when there is nothing left to save. A faint ripple of murmurs spread across the chamber. Some species, whose homeworlds had already fallen, shifted uncomfortably. Valorn's gaze hardened. We cannot afford idealism. This is not a matter of courage. It is simple mathematics. You think this is about courage? Ryder's voice remained steady, though there was steel beneath it. This is about survival. Ours, yours, everyone's. He gestured to the galactic map, to the shrinking pockets of resistance highlighted in red. They have never faced an enemy that refused to break. That is our advantage. If we give them what they expect, if we run, they will chase us down world by world until there is nowhere left to run. His words carried across the chamber, lingering in the stale air. For the first time, hesitation flickered in the expressions of some counselors. But the majority remained unmoved. A member of the Vial Ari, a race of silver-skinned humanoids with luminous eyes, leaned forward. His tone was measured, careful. Admiral Ryder, humanity has fought well beyond what any of us expected. You have demonstrated resilience, innovation. No one here denies your contributions. He paused. But what you are suggesting is impossible. We have already lost. Ryder met his gaze evenly. Not yet. Another counselor, a towering four-legged entity with a chitinous shell, clicked its mandibles. You seek to fight alone? I do not seek to convince you, Ryder said, his tone cool. I'm telling you what is going to happen. We will not retreat. We will hold the line. He straightened. Do what you will. Humanity will do what it must. A heavy pause. Then he inclined his head slightly, a gesture of formal respect. If there's nothing more, I will take my leave. No one moved to stop him. Some were too stunned. Others, unwilling to engage in what they saw as a futile act of defiance. As he turned toward the exit, a figure broke from the semicircle of counselors. Ambassador Kalis of the Telvanni, one of the few species that had fostered a strong diplomatic relationship with humanity, matched his pace with quiet urgency, his deep green robes flowing around his slender frame. You do not have to do this, Jason, Kalis murmured, his voice low enough to avoid carrying to the others. You know how I feel about these bureaucrats, but they are right about one thing. You cannot win this war alone. Ryder slowed, glancing sideways at the Telvanni. And yet, we will fight it. Kalis sighed, his golden eyes troubled. You're asking your people to die for a lost cause. We're asking them to live for one, my friend, Ryder corrected. Kalis hesitated. Ryder clasped his shoulder briefly. I appreciate your concern, my friend, but I have my duty. Kalis looked as if he wanted to say more, but instead he nodded solemnly. Then may your skies remain clear. Ryder gave a small, knowing smile. They won't be, but we'll manage. With that, he stepped past the threshold, leaving the grand hall behind. Inside, the counselors remained silent. Some turned back to their discussions, dismissing the humans' defiance as reckless desperation. But others, though they would never admit it, felt something else, a seed of doubt, a fracture in certainty. As Ryder disappeared beyond the grand doors, more than one pair of alien eyes lingered on the empty space he left behind, as if sensing, perhaps for the first time, that the war was not yet over. The war was supposed to be over, but for humanity, not yet. Days had passed since the Council's decree. While others prepared to withdraw, the humans had done the opposite. Now they were about to face what everyone else had chosen to avoid. The Atlas emerged from Slipstream with the weight of a hammer poised to strike. The massive battleship, a symbol of Earth's defiance, stood at the heart of the human fleet as it breached into the Kyria 9 system. Around it, dozens of vessels, battlecruisers, corvettes, and the last operational dreadnoughts of the United Earth Defense flashed into formation. They had not come in secret. There was no point in stealth. They had come to hold the line. On the Atlas's bridge, carrying the weight of not just his world, but other worlds threatened by the Cathar, Admiral Jason Ryder stood at the center of the command deck, his hands clasped behind his back, eyes locked on the swirling gas giant below. The system was eerily quiet, too quiet. The Cathar had not arrived yet, but they would. Soon. A sharp voice cut through the tension. "Jump signatures detected. Multiple contacts inbound," reported Lieutenant Gilbert Kovich, his eyes scanning the hollow-table interface. "Looks like they were waiting for us." Ryder exhaled slowly, unfazed. "How many?" Kovich adjusted the scanner's parameters. His expression tightened. "First wave, 30 ships, heavies, cruisers, and carriers." He paused, then muttered, "Damn it, there's more behind them." Ryder barely reacted. He had expected as much. The Cathar didn't send scouts, they sent extermination fleets. Behind him, Captain Dacre Munson studied the incoming tactical data. His jaw clenched, but his voice remained steady. "They'll try to break us before we can establish a foothold. They'll fail." Munson nodded, trusting in his commander's certainty, but not fool enough to mistake confidence for recklessness. "Orders?" Ryder didn't hesitate. "Deploy our forward line. Battlecruisers and corvettes form a staggered wall. I want overlapping kill zones on approach. Keep our dreadnoughts in reserve. Fighters stay docked until we force them into a knife fight." "Aye, sir." Munson relayed the orders. Across the fleet, engines flared as ships moved into their designated formations. Ryder's eyes narrowed on the Cathar fleet forming on the display. Even after all these years of war, their ships still had an unnatural, insectoid look. Elongated hulls bristling with spiny protrusions, dark metal that absorbed light rather than reflected it. The Atlas's sensors registered their energy signatures, each one a pulsing beacon of malice. "They'll send in the carriers first," Kovich murmured. "Try to soften us up." Ryder nodded. The Cathar had their patterns, their overconfidence. Let them try. The enemy formations surged forward, accelerating toward the human defensive line with terrifying speed. The lead carriers disgorged waves of fighters, small, predatory ships darting ahead like a swarm of locusts. Behind them, the main fleet advanced, lances of crimson energy already streaking through the void. "All stations, open fire!" The first volley erupted from the human fleet. Railguns roared, firing tungsten slugs at near-relativistic speeds. Flak batteries spat molten fragments into the swarm. Missile pods deployed, streaking toward the carriers. The Cathar fighters closed the distance, weaving through the storm of projectiles. Some burned away instantly, reduced to vapor by direct hits, but others broke through the firestorm, accelerating toward the fleet's forward ships. Inside the USS Medusa, a battle cruiser positioned at the spearhead, Commander James O'Malley braced against his command chair. The ship shuddered as energy blasts hammered against its shields. "Shields at 60%, called Lieutenant Farrow, her voice taut but controlled. "Hold the line," O'Malley barked. "Redirect all point defense to the port side. Cut down those damn fighters before they get under us." The Medusa's flak turrets rotated, shredding a Cathar squadron that had attempted a close-quarters run. In response, one of the enemy cruisers let loose a sustained particle lance, carving through space and striking a human corvette. The USS Sabre exploded in a silent eruption of debris. O'Malley's fists curled at his sides, but his voice was firm. "We're still here. Keep firing." From the Atlas, Ryder absorbed every loss, every kill, every shifting maneuver with highly disciplined focus. He spoke only when necessary, issuing new orders, redirecting units. Munson turned toward him. "They're pressing hard on the flanks." "They're impatient," Ryder murmured. "They thought we'd already be in retreat like others." Munson smirked grimly. "They didn't read the memo. That happens." A new alarm blared across the command deck. "Sir, we have more incoming." Ryder's gaze snapped to Kovich. "Reinforcements?" Kovich shook his head. "Negative. Second Cathar wave. Bigger." As if on cue, space-time ruptures tore across the system. More ships. Heavier. Dreadnoughts. The second wave of Cathar ships fell upon them like a hammer. The battlefield shifted from a brutal skirmish to full-scale annihilation combat. The human fleet adapted, shifting formation, forcing the enemy into tighter angles. "Dreadnought Leviathan, move up and reinforce the left flank," Ryder commanded. "We can't let them roll over us." The Leviathan, Earth's last surviving super dreadnought, responded immediately, its main batteries firing gravitic destabilizers. The pulses distorted space around the Cathar cruisers, breaking their cohesion. Despite the tactical ingenuity, the weight of numbers began to tell. One by one, human ships started to fall. The USS Tempest vanished in a silent flash of light. Its reactor breached. The Demon's Wake, a destroyer, was torn apart as Cathar drones boarded and gutted it from within. The bridge of the Atlas trembled as an impact rocked its lower decks. Structural damage on Deck 14. Ryder grabbed the railing, steadied himself. He could feel the tide shifting. They were holding. Barely. On another place of the galaxy, the Council watched. From the safety of a distant station in neutral space, the Galactic Council's High Command observed the battle unfold via encrypted relays. Valorn stood at the center, arms folded as his advisors muttered amongst themselves. One of the Vile Ari representatives spoke, almost regretful. "They fight like madmen." A Draenor warlord studied the footage. Unreadable. "They are dying like madmen." Valorn remained impassive. And yet, they do not break. For 3 hours, the humans had withstood the storm, longer than the projections had suggested. Still, the outcome seemed inevitable. The Cathar fleet was vast, their reserves limitless. Another counselor, a member of the Zalan Dominion, adjusted their robes uncomfortably. Surely, they know it's hopeless. Valorn's gaze lingered on the holo display. Jason Ryder stood on the Atlas, commanding his fleet with cold efficiency, refusing to yield. The High Counselor's expression remained neutral, yet his voice carried something rare, a hint of uncertainty. "Impressive," he murmured, "but certainly, they merely had luck." A silence stretched across the chamber. "Let's continue watching." The humans withstood the storm for 3 hours, then a day, 2, and now, a week. The Cathar didn't retreat entirely, but they stopped throwing everything at them. Not because they had given up, but because, for the first time, they were watching. They hadn't left Kyria 9 undefended. A portion of their fleet still lingered in the system, not attacking, not finishing the job. Just waiting. It was unnatural. The Cathar had never hesitated before, but they had also never encountered an enemy that refused to die. They assumed the humans were finished, starving, exhausted, a matter of time, and they had better things to kill. So they left Kyria 9 under watch, believing the system was already lost. That was their mistake. Ryder wasn't about to let them realize it. But before he could act, another crisis demanded his attention. "Sir, we just received an urgent transmission from the Jaltaran outpost in the Seraph Belt. They're under attack," Lieutenant Gilbert Kovich reported, his eyes fixed on the holotable's shifting data. Ryder's eyes flicked to the display, where the message repeated on a loop. Faint, distorted by interference but unmistakable. A distress call. "To any vessel receiving, Cathar forces. Planetary defenses breached. Civilian centers under fire. Repeat, we are under attack." Ryder's jaw tightened. The Jaltaran were one of the smaller civilizations in the outer sectors, their people spread across a handful of habitable moons and mining colonies. They had no fleet, no standing army. Their only defense had been the Council's promise of protection, a promise now broken. He turned to Captain Dacre Munson, who was already watching him with the same grim understanding. "We move," Ryder said without hesitation. "Sir, with respect, we can't leave Kyria 9 open." Kovich's voice was sharp. "If they realize we've weakened our lines, they'll finish the job." Munson exhaled. "So we make them think we're still here." Ryder nodded. "Deploy decoy signals across the system. False fleet chatter. Heat signature spikes. I want them seeing warships that aren't there." Kovich smirked, "Giving them ghosts to chase." "Buying time," Ryder corrected. "They think we're done. We let them believe it." "And in the meantime?" Munson asked. Ryder's eyes went to the looping distress signal. We make sure Seraph Belt doesn't share Kyria 9's fate. Ryder turned back to Kovich. Send word to the Leviathan and the Medusa. We're forming a strike force. Full burn to Seraph Belt. Kovich relayed the order. Across the system, false fleet signals began to pulse, mimicking full-strength warships moving into formation. The illusion was crude, but effective. From their distant vantage point, the Cathar watchers saw exactly what Ryder wanted them to see. A fleet that hadn't moved. Engines ignited. Within minutes, a task force was breaking away from the Kyria 9 battlefront, vanishing into slipstream. Reaching the system, the Seraph Belt was chaos. As the fleet dropped out of slipstream, the Jaltarin homeworld was already burning. The once lush forests of Tarvar were reduced to smoldering streaks of ruin. Entire city centers torn apart by orbital bombardment. Defensive outposts lay in shattered wreckage, drifting through the planet's upper atmosphere. The Cathar fleet, 2 full battle groups, was still in orbit, methodically scouring the planet clean. But they hadn't expected resistance. They never did. All ships, weapons free, Ryder ordered. Make them pay for every inch. The Leviathan, Earth's last surviving super-dreadnought, fired first. Its gravitic destabilizers pulsed through the enemy formation, rupturing a Cathar cruiser as if it were made of glass. The Medusa followed, railguns roaring, shredding enemy fighters before they could even maneuver. The Cathar hesitated. It lasted only seconds, but it was there. The first flicker of uncertainty. The moment their battlefield calculations failed. Then they reacted. Cathar warships pivoted, shifting from extermination to defense. Fighters swarmed toward the Atlas, weapon trails streaking across the void. A pair of Cathar destroyers peeled away from the main formation, angling to cut off the human fleet's escape. But Ryder wasn't here to run. Advance to low orbit, he ordered. Force them to engage at close range. It was insanity. Any rational commander would keep their distance, engage in long-range bombardment. But the Cathar weren't built for close-quarters combat. They relied on overwhelming firepower and fear, not precision dogfights. So the humans forced the knife fight. The Atlas pushed forward, flak cannons roaring, ripping apart enemy squadrons in overlapping kill zones. The USS Tiamat, a powerful battlecruiser, dove headfirst into a Cathar carrier, launching a full payload of plasma torpedoes straight into its hangar bays. The resulting explosion tore through its internal decks, cracking the ship apart from the inside. Still, the humans were outnumbered. Heavily, and they were running out of time. But the battle in orbit was only half the fight. On the surface of Tarvar, Jaltarin civilians fled through the burning wreckage of their capital, Shoral, as Cathar shock troops poured through the streets. The towering insectoid warriors moved methodically, herding survivors toward the city's central square. No prisoners, no hesitation. Then the drop pods came. From the sky, human shock troops rained down in high-speed orbital deployments, slamming into the city with the force of meteorites. The first pods burst open, and Marines emerged, rifles up, moving fast. Sergeant Masilo Bolger hit the ground running, his exosuit absorbing the impact as he snapped off shots at the first Cathar unit he saw. Plasma bolts punched through the enemy's chitinous armor, sending the warrior sprawling. "Move! Move! Move!" Bolger barked. Gunfire erupted across the streets. Humans pushed forward, breaking the Cathar advance, forcing them into bottlenecks. The enemy wasn't used to this. To them, this was supposed to be another massacre, another effortless purge. Instead, they were losing ground. And then, for the first time, the Cathar did something Bolger had never seen before. They fell back. Bolger's visor display pinged with an incoming transmission. "Sergeant Bolger, this is Atlas Actual. Cathar forces are retreating toward the eastern sector. Cut them off." Bolger grinned savagely. "Copy that." Above, in orbit, the Cathar fleet was breaking. Ryder stood on the Atlas's bridge, watching as the last of the enemy ships tried to flee. A destroyer, its hull ruptured, attempted to slip into warp, only to be annihilated by a well-placed torpedo volley from the Leviathan. "They're in full retreat," Munson confirmed. Ryder exhaled slowly. "Then we're not done yet." He turned to Kovich. "Open a channel. Let's make something clear." A moment later, The transmission broadcasted across all frequencies. "This is Admiral Jason Ryder of the United Earth Defense. Your forces are routed. Your ships are fleeing. This world is under our protection now. You thought the weak would stay weak. You thought no one would stand for them. You were wrong." Silence. Then, the remaining Cathar ships vanished into Slipstream, abandoning the system. For the first time in the war, an occupied world had been taken back. From a hidden command station, High Counselor Valorn watched the battle's conclusion. He listened to Ryder's transmission, his expression unreadable. A Zaylan official adjusted his cloak. "They continued to surprise." A Draenei commander exhaled heavily. "They should have retreated. They should have focused on themselves." Valorn didn't look away from the screen. "But they didn't," he murmured. A long pause. Then Valorn spoke. "Let's continue watching." The battlefield over Tarvar had gone quiet. For the first time, the Cathar retreated, not victorious, but defeated. On the bridge of the Atlas, Admiral Jason Ryder stood at the holotable, his gaze fixed on the shifting tactical display. Wreckage drifted in the void, both human and Cathar alike. Fires still burned in the lower atmosphere of the Jaltaran homeworld, but the people were alive. They had survived. That meant something. "Enemy fleet is gone?" Lieutenant Gilbert Kovich reported, his voice edged with disbelief. "They actually ran." Captain Dacre Munson, standing at Ryder's side, smirked. "We bled them harder than they expected. They don't know what to do when their prey bites back." Ryder nodded absently. "They'll be back," he thought. The Cathar never left anything unfinished. But this battle had done what no other had. It had exposed a weakness. Another week had come and gone. The galaxy had been watching, waiting for the inevitable collapse. But something unexpected was beginning to take shape. A flickering transmission alert pulsed at the edge of the holotable. Kovich frowned, fingers tapping the interface. "Sir, we're receiving multiple encrypted transmissions. Different frequencies, different sources. And none are from Council worlds." Munson's brow furrowed. "Civilian networks?" "No," Kovich said slowly, listening through his earpiece. "This isn't distress traffic. They're hailing us directly." Ryder's gaze sharpened. "Put it through." The primary display flickered, resolving into multiple holographic projections. Leaders, military officers, and representatives of species the Council had written off as irrelevant. Their worlds had never mattered to the greater war effort. Too small, too weak, too fragmented. They had always been told the same thing: stay out of the way and survive. And now, one by one, they had come to speak with him. A Dravani, tall and wiry, with ashen gray skin and luminous green eyes, spoke first. His voice carried an accent unfamiliar to most of the bridge crew. "Admiral Ryder, I am Varesh Kel, commander of the Dravani Free Guard." His gaze was unreadable. "You fought for the Jaltaran. You fought when no one else did." Another voice chimed in. A Makari, their insectoid carapace shimmering with bioluminescent pulses. "You are the first to do so," the Makari commander stated simply. "The Council fled. We were abandoned." A third transmission appeared. An Ithari diplomat, her blue-hued features strained. "Admiral, our world has not yet fallen, but the Cathar have begun their approach. We are not warriors. We are builders, scientists. We cannot stop them alone." Ryder studied the gathered faces. Each one represented a world that had been left behind. Worlds the Council had determined weren't worth saving. A slow realization spread through the bridge crew. This wasn't just a plea for help. It was something more. They weren't here as beggars. They were here as allies waiting to be found. In a secure conference room aboard the Atlas, Ryder stood across from the gathered holograms, his stance firm. Munson and Kovich flanked him, while a handful of officers listened in silence. Varesh Kel was the first to break the tension. "You've proven what we suspected," the Dravani commander said, arms crossed. "The Council has already lost. They retreat while you fight." Ryder kept his expression neutral. "I don't care what the Council does. I care about stopping the Cathar." A brief pause. Then, Varesh gave something that might have been the shadow of a smile. Then our interests align. The Athari diplomat hesitated, glancing at the others. We do not have the fleets to fight an open war, she admitted. But we have technology, advanced shielding systems, power distribution methods beyond what the Council employs. If you will fight, we will supply you. The Makari representative leaned forward. Our engineers can improve your vessel output efficiency by at least 20%. We request only that our surviving people be taken under your protection. More voices joined in. Commitments of resources, small battle groups, industrial support. It wasn't much. It wasn't enough to win a war. But it was a start. A damn good start. Korik leaned in slightly, voice low. Sir, this is dangerous. If we integrate them into our forces, the Cathar will take notice. They'll see us as a real threat. Ryder's gaze remained on the assembled leaders. His decision had already been made. They already do. Across the system, the first of the Dravani warships arrived. They were ragged, patched hulls, weapon systems salvaged from battlefields long lost. But they had fought before, and they would fight again. The Makari engineers dispersed across the human fleet, their multi-jointed limbs moving with unsettling precision as they integrated new energy capacitors and hull reinforcements. The Athari, true to their word, began refitting human shielding technology, extending the longevity of energy fields in ways the UED had never been able to achieve. For the first time since the war had begun, a new alliance was forming, and the Cathar noticed. In the darkness beyond the Seraph Belt, the surviving Cathar warships regrouped. Their leader, Overlord Jatharak, watched the tactical displays from the bridge of his command vessel. The humans should have broken long ago. Instead, they multiplied. An underling stepped forward, his voice cautious. The humans are integrating foreign warbands, smaller fleets, scattered forces. We do not believe them to be a significant threat. Jatharak's mandibles clicked. They weren't before, he mused. He gestured toward the projected battle recordings, the human fleet refusing to break, the sudden counterattacks, the rising losses among Cathar forces. No one was ever supposed to fight like this. The Cathar conquered through terror, through the certainty that resistance was futile. The moment their enemies saw the futility, they crumbled. But the humans, they did not believe in futility. Jatharak turned to his second-in-command. Increase pressure. Their allies are weak. Exploit them. The Cathar would adapt, or they would lose. Back aboard the Atlas, Ryder stood before the gathered commanders of his new alliance. The Cathar will coming, he said. You've seen what they do. You know what's at stake. A murmur of agreement. We're outnumbered, he continued. We're outgunned, and no one is coming to save us. The room was silent. But that doesn't mean we can't win. Varesh Kell inclined his head slightly. What do you propose? Ryder's eyes burned with conviction. We make them bleed. From a hidden chamber in the Council's high station, Valorn observed the latest intelligence reports. The humans had done something impossible. They had inspired others to stand. The High Counselor folded his hands behind his back. It was not supposed to happen this way. One of his advisors spoke hesitantly. Should we intervene? Valorn's expression remained unreadable. Not yet. A pause. Let us continue watching. It had been weeks since the first battle. The war was still raging, but something had changed. The enemy no longer moved with the same confidence. The pattern was shifting. The war was changing. The Cathar had ruled through inevitability, through the unshakable truth that no species could resist them forever. They had crushed empires, reduced entire civilizations to ash, and erased their names from history. But now, for the first time in living memory, the tide was shifting. On the bridge of the Atlas, Admiral Jason Ryder studied the new battle maps. The Alliance fleet, once a desperate collection of survivors, was now on the move. They had done more than survive. They were pushing forward. Reports streamed in. Varesh Kell's Dravani warships had struck a Cathar logistics hub along the Orion Rift, raiding fuel depots and weapons caches. The Makari engineers had finished integrating their shielding systems into the UED fleet, allowing human ships to withstand direct hits that would have crippled them weeks before. And perhaps most importantly, the Athari had cracked the Cathar encryption. They weren't expecting us to steal their communications, Captain Dacre Munson muttered as he watched the decrypted transmissions scroll across the tactical display. Arrogant bastards thought no one would last long enough to bother. Ryder's eyes narrowed. They weren't just surviving anymore. They were winning battles. Not all of them. Not easily. But the Cathar had started to bleed, and they noticed. Far beyond the Seraph Belt, in the command chambers of the Overlord Jatherak, the War Council convened. The chamber was dimly lit, the walls covered in pulsating glyphs of shifting Cathar battle data. The atmosphere was different. Before, these halls had been filled with the certainty of victory. Now, there was doubt. A high-ranking tactician stepped forward, his mandibles twitching in frustration. The humans continued to adapt. Their casualties should have broken them by now, yet they endure. Jatherak remained motionless, his large frame coiled in thought. Their survival was not predicted, he admitted. They should have collapsed under the pressure. The tactician hesitated before adding, "The fleet engaged at Tarva reports that the humans are no longer just resisting. They are pushing forward." The chamber fell silent. That word had never been used before in relation to an enemy of the Cathar. Advancing. Jatherak tilted his head, his dark eyes narrowing. "Then we are left with one option." A holographic projection expanded, displaying multiple human-controlled systems and their allied fleets. "We crush them," the Overlord said, "before they grow into something we cannot contain." The Cathar moved faster than anyone expected. Their fleet, once spread out across multiple campaigns, began to converge. They weren't just targeting human strongholds anymore. They were hunting the allies. A distress signal reached the Atlas, a Dravani colony under siege. The Cathar had skipped the outer defenses, gone straight for civilian centers. "They're trying to fracture the alliance," Kovich said, his fingers tightening into a fist. "They want to break the smaller fleets, isolate us." "They think fear will work," Munson added. Ryder watched the battle reports. He had a choice. They could pull back, reinforce existing positions, or they could take the fight to the enemy. His decision was made before anyone finished speaking. "Send the order," Ryder said. "We don't wait for them. We strike first." 3 hours later, the Atlas, the Leviathan, and the Medusa emerged from Slipstream, flanked by Dravani raiders and Makari support vessels. The Cathar fleet was already engaged with planetary bombardment. Their forces scattered as they methodically destroyed the colony below. They never saw the counterattack coming. The Leviathan fired first. Its gravitic destabilizers ripped a hole through the lead Cathar dreadnought, sending shockwaves across the fleet. Dravani strike craft swarmed, hitting exposed weak points in the Cathar formations. On the ground, human shock troopers deployed in high-altitude drops, cutting through Cathar warrior units that had already landed. Sergeant Masilo Bolger led his team through the wreckage of a destroyed colony sector, his rifle spitting rapid-fire plasma bolts into enemy squads. "We're boxing them in," Bolger barked. His comms crackled. "Bolger, this is Atlas Actual. New orders. Drive them toward the northern sector. We're cutting off their escape." A pause. "And Sergeant?" "Sir?" "Make them bleed." The Cathar forces were routed. What had started as a decisive extermination campaign had turned into a slaughter, but this time not in their favor. Ships were abandoned mid-battle. Tactical cohesion collapsed. Cathar warriors, once unstoppable, were retreating across the battlefield in disarray. Aboard the Atlas, Ryder watched as the last of the enemy signatures vanished from the battlefield. "They've never lost a system before," Munson murmured. Ryder didn't look away from the display. "They have now." The bridge was silent for a moment, save for the faint hum of systems cycling down from combat mode. Then, Kovich broke the silence. "We're receiving transmissions." Ryder arched a brow. "More allies?" Kovich shook his head. His expression was different this time. "No," he said. "Cathar defectors." In the deepest sectors of Cathar-controlled space, discontent spread. For the first time, their enemies were not afraid. For the first time, warriors began to question. Reports of human victories spread faster than the Cathar command could suppress them, and in the shadows of the Empire, a new problem emerged. Some Cathar captains refused orders, some turned against their own, and some began to wonder if humanity was not the enemy, but the example. From their high chamber, the Galactic Council remained silent. Valorn stood motionless as the latest battle report streamed across the holographic table. The humans were no longer simply resisting. They were reclaiming territory. His advisors spoke in hushed voices. "They should have been destroyed," one muttered. "Their momentum is growing," another said. "Even the Cathar feel it." Valorn's eyes narrowed. This was no longer a resistance movement. It was something more. "High Counselor," an aide asked hesitantly, "do we still remain neutral?" Valorn's fingers tapped against the metal railing. He did not answer immediately. Instead, he watched the latest battle footage. The humans were fighting a war the Council had already lost, and they were winning. Finally, Valorn exhaled. "Continue monitoring," he said. A pause. "And begin contingency preparations." Time passed, but the humans didn't break. Reports kept coming in, each one more improbable than the last. And somewhere in the vast halls of the Council, doubts began to take root. The Galactic Council had watched many wars. From their high station orbiting Solkara, they had once dictated the rise and fall of empires, balancing power between civilizations that understood their place in the Grand Order. But now, they watched something else entirely. The central chamber of the Council was filled with hushed voices, murmured conversations that carried uncertainty, a stark contrast to the usual calculated indifference. The massive holographic display projected live war footage, intercepted transmissions, and raw battle reports. It was chaos rendered in data. High Counselor Valorn stood with his arms folded, his violet skin catching the low glow of the holo screens. His four eyes scanned the battle footage in silence, absorbing each frame, each tactical shift, each human victory. The war was not supposed to unfold this way. A Zalan delegate, his elongated face betraying unease, gestured toward the footage of the latest battle. His voice was calm, but there was an undeniable edge beneath it. "How is this possible?" he muttered. The footage played in the vast chamber, floating above the central console. Cathar warships descend upon a Makari-held outpost, their cannons igniting the night sky with streaks of plasma fire. The colony's defenses crumble, its orbital platforms falling in flames. The scene is familiar, one that has played out hundreds of times before. But then, something new. Human ships emerge from slipstream. They do not hesitate. They do not form defensive lines. They attack. The Leviathan, its shields reinforced with Makari energy capacitors, plows through the Cathar formation, its primary batteries splitting an enemy destroyer in two. Dravani strike craft weave through the gaps, targeting exposed reactor points, flying closer than any sane pilot should. The Cathar fleet stalls. They expected a massacre. Instead, they find a battle. The footage flickered, cutting back to the council chamber. A Dranok warlord let out a low, rumbling exhale. "They fight differently," he said, his clawed fingers tapping against the console. "Not like the others." A female aide standing near Valorn nodded slowly. "They fight like they have nothing to lose." Valorn answered with his eyes fixed on the screen. "It's the opposite. They fight because they have everything to lose." Another transmission pinged across the chamber's display. Valorn motioned for it to be played. Captured from a surviving reconnaissance drone, the footage flickered with battle telemetry, coordinates, heat signatures, fragmented audio. It had been transmitting before its destruction, sending glimpses of the battle to anyone still listening. The feed was grainy, distorted by interference, but the message was clear. Cathar shock troops march through the ruins of a city, their towering exosuits casting shadows over the broken streets. Survivors huddle in hidden shelters, waiting for the inevitable purge. Then, the drop pods fall. Human shock troopers hit the ground running. Masilo Bulger leads his squad through the smoldering alleyways, his visor reflecting the glow of nearby fires. He raises a fist, signaling his team to halt. "Contact," he murmurs. Up ahead, a Cathar patrol moves methodically, clearing debris, checking for survivors. Bolger doesn't give them the chance. His team moves like ghosts, emerging from the smoke, blades flashing, suppressive fire hammering into the enemy before they can even react. A Cathar warrior stumbles back, their armor cracked from a well-placed plasma round. They reach for their weapon, only to be silenced by a knife to the throat. The humans don't just fight, they hunt. The feed cut out, leaving the chamber in tense silence. A Xalan strategist rubbed his temples. Their tactics are unsettling. Another counselor, an older Vailari diplomat, watched the last frame linger in the air. They are effective, he admitted. For a moment, no one spoke. Then, Valorn broke the silence. How many Cathar systems have fallen? A data technician swiped through the reports, voice steady but hesitant. 7 major outposts have been reclaimed. 4 minor colonies liberated. Several key supply lines disrupted. Valorn exhaled slowly. It was no longer a question of survival. The humans were winning engagements. A Xalan counselor folded his arms, his golden eyes narrowing. At this rate, the Cathar will retaliate in full force. They already have, another muttered. The room remained heavy with the weight of realization. The council had spent decades maintaining a delicate balance. Now, that balance was crumbling, and the humans weren't asking permission to tip the scales. Then a new transmission arrived, encrypted, coming directly from a deep space observation post. It wasn't human. It wasn't Cathar. Valorn studied the sender ID. It was a neutral system, one that had remained out of the war entirely. Play it, he ordered. The footage was captured from a long-range probe, but the details were unmistakable. A Cathar fleet was firing on itself. One of their dreadnoughts, its insignia barely visible, was exchanging fire with a group of its own cruisers. Smaller vessels broke formation, some retreating, others vanishing into slipstream. Then, a broadcast signal. The voice that came through was guttural, layered in static, but it was unmistakably Cathar. We see now. We see what you fear. They are not prey. They are not weak. You led us to believe the humans were beneath us, but they are the ones who stand. And we... The voice hesitated. We refused to die for a lie. The transmission cut out. The chamber remained silent. Some counselors exchanged uneasy glances. Others sat frozen. It was happening. The humans had done more than survive. They had fractured the enemy. Valorn felt something shift within him, something he had not allowed himself to acknowledge before now. The Cathar were not inevitable, and if that was true, neither was the Council's inaction. A younger diplomat, hesitant, finally spoke. Do we continue to observe? Valorn didn't answer immediately. He looked toward the holographic battle reports, toward the world still burning, toward the humans who had chosen to fight when no one else would. His fingers curled against the console, just enough to betray his thoughts. Continue monitoring, he said. A pause. But follow with the contingency plans. Weeks had turned into months, and still the humans stood. What should have been a swift and crushing end had stretched into something else entirely. Now, the war was reaching a point no one had predicted. The Cathar came in force. The warning signals blared across the Atlas's bridge before the tactical officers could even process the full scale of the incoming fleet. Multiple slipstream ruptures. Damn it, they're not holding back this time, Lieutenant Gilbert Kovich announced, fingers moving swiftly over the holotable. Confirmed dreadnoughts, assault carriers, full warbands. They're bringing everything. Admiral Jason Ryder, focused as always, kept his eyes locked on the ever-growing red markers flooding the battle map. He had expected this. The Cathar weren't just here to fight. They were here to end it. Behind him, Captain Dacre Munson added with his characteristic sarcasm, "Guess we made them nervous." Ryder's brow furrowed. They should be. The Alliance fleet, the remnants of Earth's armada, the Dravani Free Guard, the Makari engineers, the Ithari defense flotilla, and a dozen smaller, desperate factions, was never meant to hold out this long. The Cathar no longer knew what they were fighting for. Now, they were scrambling to correct their mistake. The Battle of Tannen's Rift began before the first shot was fired. From the heart of the Cathar fleet, Overlord Jatharak watched as the final pieces of his trap fell into place. The humans had fought beyond reason, refused surrender, and bled his forces dry, more than any species before them. Now, he would remind them who they were dealing with. The Alliance was outnumbered 3-1. Jatharak curled his claws against the armrests of his command throne. Crush them. Show them resistance is meaningless. Break the back of this rebellion before it spreads. Advance, he commanded. The first wave hit like a hammer. The Atlas shuddered under the impact of kinetic slugs and particle lances, its shields flaring under the barrage. "All units, defensive maneuvers," Ryder barked. "Hold the line. We break here. We lose everything." Human and Dravani warships interlocked in staggered formations, using overlapping fire zones to create a kill box of concentrated energy bursts. The Makari shield enhancements held firm, but the Cathar pressed harder, testing every inch of the defensive grid. In the chaos, the Leviathan powered up its gravitic destabilizers, releasing space-rending pulses that ripped through the Cathar's heavy battle cruisers. Explosions blossomed across the void. But still, the Cathar came, and they didn't stop. On the first day, the Alliance held the line, but barely. Human corvettes wove through Cathar formations, deploying EMP charges that scrambled their targeting arrays. Dravani raiders struck logistics ships, forcing the enemy to reroute reinforcements. Sergeant Masilo Bulger led his ground forces through the ruins of Tannen's primary outpost, engaging in close-quarters skirmishes against Cathar shock troops. "Their reinforcements aren't stopping," Bulger growled, pressing against a shattered column as enemy fire ripped through the air. "Hold," came the reply from command. "We need time to reposition artillery." Bulger gritted his teeth. "Tell them to hurry the hell up." On the day 3, the Cathar adjusted tactics, targeting supply lines instead of head-on engagements. "They're trying to starve us out," Munson muttered, studying the latest fleet movement data. "Cut our resupply routes. Pick us apart piece by piece." Ryder anticipated this. "They think we need time to recover," he said. "They don't understand us at all." Instead of falling back, Ryder sent the fleet forward, attacking Cathar forward command positions, disrupting their formation before they could lock in their siege. The enemy hesitated, for the first time, and Ryder made them pay for it. At the 7th day, the war wasn't breaking the humans. It was breaking the Cathar. On the bridge of the Atlas, a sudden alert cut through the battle reports. Kovach's eyes widened. "Sir, we have incoming ships." Ryder's head snapped toward him. More of them? No. Kovach's voice was strange. The main holoscreen updated. New contacts, multiple fleets inbound. Not Cathar, not the Alliance, the Council. A transmission came through, direct to Ryder's channel. The hologram flickered, then stabilized, a familiar face appearing on the display. It was Valorn, and he was not alone. Behind him stood representatives of every major species in the Galactic Council. The silence stretched between them for only a moment. Then Valorn spoke, his voice measured. "You gave us no choice, Admiral." Ryder felt the weight of those words settle. Then Valorn's expression shifted, determined. "We'll see you on the battlefield." The transmission cut. Munson let out a breath of disbelief. "You have got to be kidding me." The final days of the war had arrived, but not in the way anyone had imagined. What had started as a desperate act of defiance had become something far greater. The Cathar fleet, once the dominant force in the galaxy, was in full retreat. Their formations fractured, their chain of command shattered, and the aura of inevitability that had surrounded them for centuries was gone. On the bridge of the Atlas, Admiral Jason Ryder watched the battlefield unfold. The red markers that had once swarmed across the battle map like a plague were now vanishing, one by one. Some ships were destroyed, others attempted to flee, but there was nowhere left to run. "Confirmed," Lieutenant Gilbert Kovach announced. "The last of their heavy cruisers just abandoned the line. The rest of their forces are scattering." Captain Dacre Munson, standing at Ryder's side, exhaled through his nose. "So, that's it," he muttered. "After all this time, they're running." Ryder didn't answer immediately. He studied the battle map, his eyes flicking across the debris fields, the wreckage of hundreds of ships, both human and Cathar. His fleet was battered, the cost beyond imagining. But the impossible had happened. The Cathar were breaking, and this time there would be no coming back. Across the battlefield, the reality of their defeat set in. On the Cathar flagship, Overlord Jatharak stood at the center of his burning command bridge, his mandibles twitching as reports came in from panicked fleet commanders. His warlords were dead, his dreadnoughts disabled, his warriors demoralized. They weren't just losing, they were unraveling. The fear they had used to dominate the galaxy had turned against them. Once, species had collapsed at the mere sight of Cathar warships. Now they fought without hesitation. The humans had done this. "They will hunt us," one of his remaining generals said, his voice laced with an emotion the Cathar had never allowed themselves to feel before. Dread. Jatharak's claws tightened against the command console. This was not how the war was supposed to end. With a deep, resigned growl, he gave his final order. All remaining ships, retreat. And for the first time in their history, the Cathar ran. The fleeing Cathar ships streaked into slipstream, desperate to reach any corner of space where the humans wouldn't follow. But they hadn't learned. The Atlas and the remaining Alliance fleet were already in pursuit. "We've got them locked," Kovich confirmed. "They're trying to scatter, but we're tracking every movement." Munson cracked a grin. "Time to finish the job?" Ryder's eyes flicked toward the remaining battle groups, the Dravani warships already in position to intercept, the Makari vessels deploying electronic warfare pulses to disrupt the enemy's escape routes. The Cathar had spent centuries ensuring that no one who opposed them survived. Now, they would finally know what it meant to be prey. Ryder's voice was calm, firm. "Engage at will." And the hunt began. Across the galaxy, Cathar garrisons fell silent. Without their fleet, without their warlords, without the undeniable grip of fear that had sustained them for so long, their empire collapsed inwards. Worlds that had once been occupied under the banner of extermination now rose in defiance, their people choosing to fight rather than surrender. The Cathar had always believed that their dominance was eternal. Now they were the ones being erased, and the galaxy would never be the same. The war was over, but Ryder knew that one final piece remained. The Council fleets emerged from FTL, their banners now aligned with the alliance they had once abandoned. On the Atlas, Ryder turned as a hailing frequency opened. Valorn's holographic form materialized, his expression carefully neutral. But there was something new in his posture. Not the distant political indifference of the past, but acknowledgement. "You left us no choice, Admiral," Valorn said, repeating the words from before. Ryder gave him a look of calm amusement. "And yet you still hesitated." A pause. Valorn exhaled. "Not anymore." Ryder glanced at the battle map one last time. The Cathar signals had vanished. The fleet was battered, their forces pushed to the edge. Pockets of resistance would remain, stragglers unwilling to accept reality. But the war itself was over. Kovich let out a slow breath. "So that's it then?" Munson, ever the cynic, shook his head. "Took them long enough." Ryder didn't smile. He simply watched the stars, feeling the weight of everything that had led to this moment. The war had changed the galaxy, and humanity had proven itself in ways no one had ever imagined. He turned away from the display, speaking the last words of the war. Now, after all these years, this war is finally over. The Atlas continued onward, drifting into a galaxy forever changed. Humanity had refused to retreat, and in doing so, they had become something greater. Hey there again. I'm glad you've come so far. Hope you enjoyed the video. Remember to hit the like button and the subscribe button. This is really important to the channel. Really important. And I have one more thing for you. I've chosen another video for you to watch. Just click the card here, or here if you want the whole playlist. See you there.